Lag BaOmer and Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and Rabbi Akiva takes us back to events 1800 years ago in the land of Israel and teaches us a crucial lesson in the indestructibility of the Jewish people. I'd like to have a closer look at the events surrounding this moment in Jewish history, because this was a crucial crossroads of events where the Roman Empire had completely destroyed the Second Temple and were dominating the land of Israel, and at the same time trying to eradicate all traces of Judaism and Torah learning and teaching. Against that background, the Gemara in Yevamah Samach Beis tells us that Rabbi Akiva stubbornly refused to stop teaching Torah, and he went around the whole country, Migeves Vad Antifras, from north to south, all over the area, and he was teaching Torah. And he reached, the Gemara says, amazingly, 24,000 Talmidim. And you would have thought at that point the future of Torah had been secured. Except that, tragically, they all died in a very short period. That's the story that we're told in the Gemara. Now, the truth is, from a practical point of view, it's hard to imagine how Rabbi Akiva managed to reach 24,000 Talmidim, given the fact that he had no access to any big buildings or halls or Beis HaMedrash or anything, that all Torah learning was illegal and being persecuted, and it took place in caves and attics and in cellars, and took place privately. And how did Rabbi Akiva manage, without any technological assistance, to have 24,000 Talmidim all learning his Torah all over the place at this very, very difficult time? In addition, the next question mark is, how come we've never heard of these Talmidim, 24,000 Talmidim of Rabbi Akiva? We've never heard of them before or since. We don't know the name of a single one of them. We haven't heard any Torah mentioned in their names, even though the Mishnah and the Gemara are very particular to mention Divrei Torah in the names of the person who taught it. We don't know the names of any one of them or where they came from or what they did. Who were these 24,000 anonymous Talmidim of Rabbi Akiva, and why did they die all in one shot, and what exactly is happening here? This whole story is something of a very perplexing story. But clearly there was a large group of Talmidim who he relied on for transmitting the Torah further, and at a certain point they were killed by a plague or whatever it was. What's interesting here is to combine this story of Rabbi Akiva together with the historical background of that period. That the Gemara in Yerushalmi tells us that Rabbi Akiva was not only the greatest Torah teacher of his age. He wasn't the only Torah teacher, incidentally. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah was teaching Torah, Rabbi Yossi HaGalili was teaching Torah, Rabbi Gamliel was teaching Torah, but Rabbi Akiva was, in many ways, the prominent teacher of all times. But the Gemara in Yerushalmi in Tainus tells us, in addition to being that, he was also the major supporter, spiritually and ideologically, of the Bar Kokhba leadership and the Bar Kokhba revolt against the Romans. He believed that it was possible to revolt against the Romans and remove them from Judea, from the land of Israel, and re-establish Jewish sovereignty by the revolt. And for a few years it seemed like it was going to be successful. And then what happens in the end, we all know tragically what happens in the end, that the Hadrianic massacres simply were overwhelmingly brutal and overwhelmingly massive, and it ended in the tragedy of Beitar, and that was the end, really, of Jewish life in the land of Israel. After that, the center of Jewish life moves to Bovel, and that's why the Talmud is later on written in Bovel, not in the land of Israel. In any event, Rabbi Akiva teaches us a lesson, that against the background of all this terrible suffering, he decides that even though the students that he had cultivated and he had led and he had inspired for most of his life, even though they are no longer alive, he is going to start again. This power to start again after a tragedy, and not to be traumatized by it, not to be bitter about it, but to retain the emunah and the optimism and the determination and what is called today the resilience, to be able to rebuild again from total nothingness. That is something which is the secret of the indestructibility of the Jewish people. This is really the Am Yisrael Chai at a deeper level. symbolized by Rabbi Akiva, who is able to say, I'm not going to give in to these Romans. We can't beat them militarily, and we can't overcome them, but guess what? We can ensure the transmission of Torah to the next generation, and by doing so, Judaism will survive, and Am Yisrael will survive, because the values of Torah, the values of morality, the values of family life, the values of learning, teaching Torah, our connection to Am Yisrael and to Eretz Yisrael, all that is within the Torah. The Torah remains the main core of the future of Klal Yisrael. And by teaching it further to the next generation, he secures the future. Says the Gemara, he decided in his later life, beziknuto, in his later part of his life, he decided that he's not going to go for quantity of Talmidim, he's going to go for quality. And he chooses 5 Talmidim. And one of the stars of those Talmidim is Rav Shimon bar Yochai. So he has 5 Talmidim, Rav Shimon bar Yochai, Rav Meir, Rav Yossi, Rav Yehuda bar Eloi, and Rav Elazar ben Shamua. Those are the 5 Talmidim who he chooses to go forward into the next generation and teach his Torah further. And we know, because we are recipients of the Mishnah, that these voices of these Talmidim, they are the key material in the entire Mishnah. What maybe we fail to realize completely is that that period of time, the Torah Shebaal Peh was only orally transmitted, verbally transmitted. There was nothing was written down. In fact, it was forbidden to write it down. So what did that mean exactly? It meant that the whole Torah Shebaal Peh, imagine all the Shulchan Aruch and the Rambam and all the ideas in the Shas, Bavli and Yerushalmi and Mishnah, everything, all those ideas, where did they exist? They existed only in the minds of a handful of individuals. And those handful of individuals were being hunted down by the Romans and being killed one by one. So the whole of the future transmission of Torah Shebaal Peh was hanging by a thread, was tolui basara, was hanging by a thread. And Rabbi Akiva realized that unless something is done, the thread could be broken, and that could be the end of the Jewish people. So he risks his life. He teaches these 5 Talmidim against all advice and against endangering his life and everybody's life in order to make sure that there would be a continuation to the Torah. And indeed, there's a very interesting point here about Lag BaOmer, which I'd like to add, which is we are generally told that the celebration of Lag BaOmer is somehow connected to the Yartzeit, to the day of the death of Rav Shimon bar Yochai, and we're celebrating that, which is somewhat strange because our tradition doesn't celebrate a Yartzeit as a Yontif. Quite the contrary. Shulchan Aruch brings down that on a Yartzeit, it is the opposite of a Yontif. It's a sad day. Many people fast on a Yartzeit. Certainly the Yartzeit of Moshe Rabbeinu and other individuals was commemorated with a fast day, not by a Yontif. So why are we exactly celebrating Lag BaOmer? So I'm following in this the writings of one of the great Rabbonim of our generation, Rabbi Yaakov Hillel Shlita, who is an author of great repute and a leader and a thinker and a posek and a Kabbalist, a very interesting Rav living here in Yerushalayim. And he brings down in the name of 2 great Mekubolim who were Rabbonim of Yerushalayim. One of them was somebody called Rabbi Yaakov da Silva, who wrote a commentary called the Pri Chodosh, which is printed in all standard Shulchan Aruchs, is a commentary written in the 17th century by this man, the Pri Chodosh, and in it he writes that actually the Simcha of Lag BaOmer isn't the day of the Petira of Rav Shimon bar Yochai, it's the day of the Smicha of Rav Shimon bar Yochai. When Rav Shimon bar Yochai received Smicha from Rabbi Akiva, that was the turning point at that crossroad in Jewish history, which guaranteed the future of Torah, and that's the Simcha. We're celebrating the tremendous inner strength of people working against an unbelievably dangerous and antagonistic environment and culture and preserving Torah at all costs. And at the day that he got Smicha, and in fact, one of the great Rabbonim in Yerushalayim of the next generation, the Chidah, in his commentary, Birkei Yosef, on the Shulchan Aruch, Rab Chaim David Yosef Azulai, he also writes that this day was the day of the Smicha of Rav Shimon bar Yochai, not the death of Rav Shimon bar Yochai. And to me, that makes much more sense. That's indeed something to celebrate. that Rabbi Akiva gave smicha to these individuals and he empowered them to go forward into the next generation. This is the key to the indestructibility of Klal Yisrael. The Bar Kokhba revolt was a heroic attempt to re-establish Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel, and it could have worked, but for all various reasons, it didn't work. And that was a tremendous massacre, and it ended in Beitar, where hundreds of thousands of people lost their lives, and it was really the end of large Jewish demographic presence in the land of Israel. It was the end of any political power, both economically and physically. It really was the biggest blow possible to the Jewish people, and that's part of the sadness of these 24,000 Talmidim. They were his followers. They died as part of this terrible tragedy. That's the sadness of the first part of Sfiras Omer. But the simcha of the second part of Sfiras Omer, starting with Lag BaOmer, is that it didn't spell the end of the Jewish people because of the tenacity, the emunah, and the simchas chayim of Rabbi Akiva. His optimism was able to restart and to teach again Torah to these 5 individuals, and in that sense to give us the message that Lag BaOmer is relevant to every individual and every generation. We hope to be successful and overcome all our difficulties, but in the event we find that there are difficulties and events which we can't overcome, to have the ability to bounce back and to rebuild. If you speak to people who are Holocaust survivors and you think to yourself, how did they manage? How did they manage after everything they had been through? I spoke often to my mother-in-law, Zichrona Livracha, Mrs. Bluma Avers from Amsterdam, who had a number on her arm as a teenager. She was taken away from Amsterdam to Auschwitz, and she went through hell. But Baruch Hashem, she survived and came back to Amsterdam to find nothing, not a single relative, not a single house, no possessions, nothing at all. But she and that small group of survivors decided, Am Yisrael Chai, we're going to show the world that the Jewish people are alive and well. We're going to have big families. We're going to build communities. We're going to rebuild shuls and schools. And they started again from scratch. And the whole establishment of Medinat Yisrael, 1948, was equally run by and defended by people who were Tzebrachim Yidden, who came out of the Holocaust, and they restarted with great optimism and with great resilience. And part of that is the legacy of Rabbi Akiva and the celebration of Lag BaOmer. And Yehi Ratzon, we should always have within us that ability to rebuild Klal Yisrael and to restart even in difficult circumstances. And with that, we give thanks to the great leaders of Klal Yisrael, and we celebrate Rabbi Akiva and Lag BaOmer B'Leiv Shalom. Amen.